Gregor. So he's been an engineer and instructor for over 20 years, just writing code and mentoring. A lot of you know because you guys are his students. So in 2006, Gregor found DataLink Technologies LLC and Dzierzon Consulting. He consults as a developer, architect, and teaches a wide range of technical topics. When he's not programming, he loves spending time watching and coaching his kids in their sports, creating things with wood in his workshop, or making improvements to his house. You are a wholesome person, and that's super cool. I'm here for it. Cool. So I will now stop presenting, and I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Nan. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So if I can get the right screen up here, there we go. So I just want to start by just doing a little introduction of what we're going to cover. And as you heard a little bit about me. So we're going to create RESTful services, RESTful API with ASP.NET Core and Swagger. And the code is all going to be, it's actually already available. The code that we're going to go over is on my GitHub account. So you can see it there. I'll also share the link in the chat when we're done here as well. So we'll talk about that. But before we jump right into the code, I wanted to also, if I can get the right slide, there we go. I just got to click on the right spot. That's the problem. So what we're going to cover, three main topics. So we're going to talk about what is REST, just to make sure we've got a solid baseline that we're, as we kind of get into this. We're going to take a look at how to build a RESTful service with ASP.NET Core with WebAPI. Specifically, we're going to go with ASP.NET Core 6. So I think when I first introduced or suggested this topic, we were for sure ASP.NET Core 5. It might have even been ASP.NET Core 3.1 if I remember correctly. It's just the timing had never worked out because I used to travel so much. So now we're finally here. And so I'm going to be using ASP.NET Core 6 to do that. And it actually, what's cool is this next part with Swagger, it actually makes developing with Swagger much easier because it's built right into ASP.NET Core 6. So not a whole lot of configuration that we have to do to make that part work. All right. So just a brief introduction to where we started and where we are now with REST. So remote, I guess, distributed programming is not, it's not new, right? And that's what RESTful services are. We're just doing distributed programming. If we think about it, we've had back before .NET, we had, there's RPC, so remote procedure calls. In VB6, I used to do, we did some distributed COM internally or DCOM. And then when .NET came out, they introduced SOAP or ASMX Web Services. I'm guessing some of you, maybe a lot of you remember that and how fun those were. And then, of course, in addition to SOAP, we had .NET remoting and being able to build RESTful services like something. Of course, REST was already introduced by this point. So we had WCF or Windows Communication Foundation to be able to do those. So I bring all those up just as kind of an intro into when we move into talking about REST. And then I'm at least going to touch on, another remote service that's available now that kind of was introduced after REST, which is GraphQL, and maybe kind of compare some of those things, at least in talking about, why we would choose REST over some of these other options. I'm really only going to compare WCF, REST, and GraphQL. And the reason is because pretty much everything from RPC up to WCF, the way that we would program and the way that we approached problems was pretty much exactly the same, at least the philosophy behind how we did it. But the philosophy completely changed with how we did distributed computing with REST. And then GraphQL is another one that came after that kind of shifted things around again. So I just want to take a look and compare, what are some of the differences? First of all, with every one of the things that we do, the idea is we're exposing resources remotely, right? Most commonly, we're probably talking about relational databases. So that's what I'm going to use in our example today. I'm just going to do it turns out, since I'm self-employed, I have to do all my own taxes and things. And so it's tax season, and I needed a way to get all of my expenses together real quick. So actually, over the past month, I built a RESTful service. I built a little API to allow me to get my expenses together real quick. And I used RESTful services. So I decided that would be pretty good to just tweak it a little bit so we could do it here, use that for our example inside of here. And I'm going to keep it really simple. We're really just looking at a category, maybe a subcategory, and then an expense table. So, but it's a resource. It's an external resource that we want to expose on one computer so we can access it elsewhere, right? So, comparing some of the differences. Now, before I get into look at some of the bullet points, the thought process behind what we did with REST. With WCF or SOAP, really, we did everything. The server was kind of our business logic. So it was a thick client. It was, a thick server. So all the logic was there. We did our business logic. If we would just make a request, we had methods that did everything that we need to do on the business logic, and then just return the data to the client as well. In order to make that work, because there wasn't really many standards. Every company had different standards. We had to really rely on heavy documentation just to understand how each of the methods worked, right? So with that, with each endpoint, there are many methods. And so every endpoint and every method that we want to compute, we had to learn how pretty much every method in every endpoint worked, because there were frequently just a whole lot of differences with each of those. It kind of reminds me again, like of remote procedure calls or RPCs, where really you had to spend a lot of time just getting to understand or getting to learn what the endpoint does, not just what the data is. And it really worked as our business layer. With RESTful services, it's much more resource driven, right? The whole idea is, I like to think of it like a database. Really, it's my CRUD operations. It's going to house the data that I want. And I'm just going to go and get the data, and I can do inserts, updates, deletes. There's of course some tweaking with that, but it's not heavy on business application, and it's very standardized. So little documentation is needed. As long as we know what the resource looks like, how to use it is not an important factor. And then finally, each endpoint points to a resource. It's not a business logic. It's not a rule that you're going to. You're just pointing to a resource, and then so the endpoint only has very few actions. And then finally, like I said already, it's more of just a repository layer. There are some limitations with REST just because of how it's done. Each resource has an endpoint, and so if you want to get a lot of data, it's not like a relational database where I can join two resources together. The whole idea behind REST is that you're accessing one resource and only one resource. And then you get it back. So if you need additional things, you potentially need to make a lot of calls back and forth to your server. So GraphQL kind of came about at that point. So in GraphQL, we talk about both resources and the related data. So we're able to get multiple things at one time. Not just one, maybe not just like the expenses table. I could get the expenses and its categories and everything that's associated with it as well. It follows more of a semantic model where we look at the structure, which almost looks like a database schema, and then we allow the client to decide which data you want. Whereas REST really says, if you want an expense, you get the whole expense and everything that has to do with the expense, right? And sometimes I've got a table that has hundreds of fields in it or hundreds of values, and I only need one of them. With REST, it's too bad. I get the whole thing or nothing. With GraphQL, I have the ability to say, well, I'm just going to take part of it and just say which field I want out of there. So it kind of goes back to the day of, it's a little bit of a mix between the semantic model that we kind of saw in SOAP or WCF and so on. And then the endpoint only has a few actions as well. So it's kind of a mix between REST and WCF, like I said. And again, it's also a repository layer. So which one do we choose? Well, it really depends. It's a different tool for different purposes, but we're going to kind of focus on what we're doing with REST. So oh, REST versus GraphQL again, or WCF, REST, and GraphQL. WCF, most everything is, the server is very flexible because you have the ability to do whatever you want to do, but the client is highly dependent on the server. So the client is rigid, right? REST, the server is rigid because we have standards on what it should be, and the client is rigid. So it's very standardized. That's the power, and maybe also the drawback of using REST. The power is that I can work with RESTful services in one job, and then I can go to another job. And if I work with RESTful services, I don't have to relearn how they do everything. As long as they're adhering to the standards, it's exactly the same. So their rigidity gives us actually a lot more stability as well. GraphQL, same thing. The server is going to be rigid because it defines what our model is, but the client is really flexible because the client can now decide which data they want. So it gives a little bit of flexibility back into development to be able to request only the data that you want or update only the data that you're interested in updating. Okay, so what does REST actually solve? Sorry, that was red. That was really bright all of a sudden. I did not anticipate that. Let's take a look. So REST, like I said, it's a standard. It's a well-defined architectural standard. So it's going to separate the business domain from the resources. It has well-defined and a set number of verbs and actions that you can do, and it focuses on the resource, not on the business logic or on the relationships. WCF and SOAP methods. Think of some of the different methods that are inside of there. I might have hundreds of different methods, and I have to rely on the method name to know what data is in there. So if I say get expenses by ID or get all expenses, add expense, get category, the function name will hopefully give me a hint of what's going on inside of there, but there's no guarantee because it's completely up to the developer to decide how they're gonna name their functions. Whereas in REST, it's all based on the resource. So we know what a named resource is. And then with that one resource, we can do all of our CRUD operations. So we can get, it's our select, post is insert, put, update, delete, of course, is delete. And then some of the others, patch, that's another version of update, which we won't really focus on here. We'll just look at the delete. And then there's some kind of metadata things like options, what options are available, head. These are all requests that we can make to say what's available at this resource. So we can query the resource to get the data that we're interested in. The other thing that REST really introduces is this idea of idempotence. And so what is idempotence, or what does it mean to have a service that is idempotent? It basically means it's something that I can do. I can make the function call over and over and over again, and I'll get the same result over and over. So well, let's take a look. If I try to do an update, if I update a value, a resource to, like if I update my name to Gregor, I can say update Gregor, update name equals Gregor. I can say that over and over again. The result is always going to be the same. It doesn't change anything. And so REST really kind of, that's one of the kind of important principles that REST is founded on. And if we take a look at the different verbs, get is idempotent because I can make a request call. I don't actually change anything on the server. All I'm doing is I'm returning something. So a get method should never make a change to the server. So that's idempotent. A post is when I'm inserting something. That's not idempotent. The whole idea is I'm adding a new record. And so I'm updating the server. Put is, or I say it should be, if we're following REST principles, it should be idempotent. Every time, if I make the same update call, the end result to the server should be exactly the same, no matter how many times I do that. Same with delete. I can call delete on ID 1 5 times. It's only going to delete the record the first time, but I'm not going to delete additional records. And then patch, the same thing. It's like put, it's going to be idempotent as well. Finally, the last thing we want to look at is what is Swagger. Just with RESTful services, as we're developing, the whole idea is we need a good way, an easy way to test our services in when we're creating RESTful services, right? So rather than always having to go initially early on, we'd build, we'd build a client, and so there'd be a lot of upfront work to build the client. Now Google came out with Postman, so we'll look at that. as well, but we wanted the ability to view and test what our RESTful services are very quickly. And Swagger, which is now actually called OpenAPI, you can still go to swagger.io to get the resources for this. But Swagger is just a tool that's built right into our service. So when I run and test this, a website will come up with all these methods where I can see what endpoints I have available, and I can test them right from here. So it's just a quick way to give me the ability to see what the end result is of my service, or to interact with my service without having to build, you know, an Angular or React client just to make sure it works the way I expect it to. So, okay, that is the intro. Let me switch over to looking at our looking at the code. Before I move on, any comments or any questions or thoughts on anything I've discussed so far? All right. So let me share a different screen. So I'm using SQL Server Express to run my database. I've got 4 tables here. We're actually really only going to focus on these 3. The member table just has the member name. So if somebody else made a purchase on the expense, I could see that as well. But really, I'm just going to focus mostly on these 3 items. If you want to create this, all you need is to have SQL Express installed, and in the repo that I have uploaded, there's a script that will actually create that database for you. And it doesn't insert any expenses, but it inserts a few categories and subcategories as well. So you should be able to run the database just to have that available. But there's our structure, what we're going to look at. Let's go to, I just want to mention also how I've structured the code that we're going to look at here. So I am using a web or ASP.NET Core MVC, and so I'm just using the web API. So Core will receive a request, right, and the server or ASP.NET Core server will distribute, or it'll dispatch the task to whichever controller. So I'm going to have a different controller. We'll take a look at what the controller has, but here I have an expenses controller that's specific to working with expenses. And then if I want to get a list of all expenses, I'm going to use the kind of the service pattern where I go to the expense service where it does all the work. It actually connects to the database to get the data. So all of my CRUD operations are done inside of here. The controller really just serves as the interface to my data layer. All right. I am going to use dependency injection, and so we're going to see how we want to configure that. So with what ASP.NET provides for us is, if I want to make a call, it provides the web server interface where we just need to add a few configurations. And when a request comes into our web server, those configurations will say, okay, how am I going to do this? So part of the configuration is going to be pointing to the right controllers. I need to configure my my dependency injection inside of there. So we'll take a look at how that's set up. And then also configure the Swagger document so that we actually run Swagger right from here. Let's run it and just see what it looks like, and then we'll kind of build on a couple of things. So if I run my expense API, can I see? Oh, it came up in the right window even. Nice. So this is Swagger. So just because I've configured Swagger, and like I said, it is configured by default, it gives me the ability to display this. So I'm going to have a categories controller, and that controller gives me the CRUD operations for all categories. So I've got a couple of gets, a post, a put and delete, talk about those, but I've got my expenses controller and my subcategories controller. So the idea here is, let me zoom in slightly. So if I look at the categories, it will actually show me some information about what the categories does, and I can test it from here. So if I hit try it out, it doesn't require any inputs on this one at least, and I'm going to hit execute. And it'll show me what method it executed to run this, and I get my result down here. So I've got 3 categories: office supplies, travel, and miscellaneous. So it actually made my request to my server and ran it from there, right? So that's one of the benefits that we'll see some of the other options that we have inside of here. But one of the benefits is I can test these very quickly without having to open up Postman. I don't have to type a bunch of stuff in, which is nice. I can test posts, gets. The other thing that Swagger does, well, there's a number of things, but another thing that Swagger does for us is it kind of helps keep us standardized. So Swagger kind of enforces, it kind of pushes us to follow good REST standards and follow good practices if we want to build RESTful services, because they kind of guide you to doing that. So you'll notice that the endpoint or the URL is really what matters here. Since when I'm dealing with categories, everything that's related to categories is prefaced with this /category. So if I want to get all categories, I'd come here. If I want to get a specific category, I would still do a get method. And if I want to test it, notice it gives me the ability to specify, okay, I want to see category 2, and I execute that. And you'll see that it went to HTTP localhost categories 2. And so there's the pattern, the RESTful pattern to go to that resource, and it gives me only that one resource, right? Those are gets, right? All I'm doing is requesting services. I also have the ability to do post. And if I want to add a new category, for example, Swagger looks at the data structure and it gives me a schema of what I need to do, what my JSON needs to look like in order to insert a new record. So to insert a new category. So if I want to try it out, I can click on try it out, and it kind of pre-populates this. Since my RESTful service, I don't need to start with a category ID because the database or the service layer is going to create the ID for me because I've got auto number fields in there. So really, I just need to add a title. Oh, for category, I guess I could go with, what do I have? I have travel. We'll just say entertainment. That's an important category. Got to always have some good entertainment, right? And I don't, all that is fun. Okay. We'll go ahead and hit execute, and we'll see as I'm testing this, the result is once I've executed it, it created a method, and it's a post method now. So I'm inserting something, I'm requesting it to be a post, and then it added as the body my JSON document. And the response was it added a new category with ID 5, entertainment, and all that is fun. So of course, if I want to verify that that actually worked, I can come up to my categories and execute, and we should see that there are now, well, it looks like I must have had an ID 4 at some point. So I now have 1, 2, 3, and 5 in my categories. So that worked. Okay, enough about categories. Let's, I do want to look at the categories. Well, let's look at the code and just to see how we get there. I'd like to spend more time on the actual expenses, which is where it gets a little bit more interesting with how RESTful services work. So let's look at my Solution Explorer. I'm going to go to control. Actually, before I go to controllers, I want to take a look at how our server is configured. So when you create a new project in Visual Studio, zoom in a little bit here. One of the main differences that you're going to see if you haven't worked with ASP.NET Core 6 yet, there's a significant difference that you're going to see here. In fact, I think I want to just let's do Let me do, open up another Visual Studio, and I'm going to create a new project. If it loads eventually. Not quite sure why it's taking, oh, there we go. So we go ahead and choose an ASP.NET Core Web API. I just need to specify where I want to store that. So I'm going to use ASP.NET Core Web API. It is going to follow the MVC pattern. I'm going to go into projects. Let me go into, actually, I'm going to go into my repos. There's a talks, and I'll just do, I'll select that folder and I'll call this API demo. And I'll go ahead and hit next. Is that that's a DemP, it needs to be demo. My eyes are failing me here. So are my fingers. So let's hit next. Okay, so here is where we specify which version of .NET we're going to go with. And I am going to choose .NET 6. So everything else I can leave the same. Let's hit create. And I just want to take a look at what's different from previous versions of .NET Core to now. If you have used .NET Core 5 or earlier before, you'll probably be used to building these web APIs. You'll see a program.cs, which is our entry point, and then there's a start.cs, right, or startup. I can't even remember. And .NET 5 isn't even, or .NET Core 5 isn't even that long ago. I think it's startup.cs. C#6 or .NET 6 goes away with that. So if we come into program.cs, this might also be something that you've seen. It doesn't even have a class. It's just a file. So it feels more like a JavaScript or a Python file where you can just start writing code. And of course, when it compiles, it still becomes the program.cs, or still becomes a program class like everything. They just try to kind of mask that to make it a little bit easier. So what's inside of program.cs is everything that was in both program and startup.cs before. And so instead of calling those methods to build your service, we just start by creating a builder, which is a web application builder. And it has all the services and environments and all the different variables that we need inside of here. So it's very quick and easy to launch a brand new application. So this hosts our web server right here. So you see, we're going to create a new builder with args by saying services.add controllers. That's what makes it possible to go ahead and just use API controllers directly. We're going to use the endpoints API Explorer so that we can navigate that. And notice that this line is added in here, add Swagger. That was not in there before. That was recently added in .NET 6. Before, we would have had to add a reference to Swagger. You'll see, if I go to my dependencies here, if I go to my NuGet packages, what's installed, the only dependency that I have right now is swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. That's Swagger, basically. So swashbuckle is what allows that to happen. So when you create a new .NET 6 application, you've got Swagger built right in. And they have in typical Microsoft fashion, they have a default template little application that you can run from. So we've got one controller, which is my weather forecast controller. And if we look at the controller, we can just see we've just got some default data inside of there. So notice, just by creating an application, if I run my demo, it should bring up Swagger. Before, it just brought up a blank website, and you could host either your own application, but here it actually takes us right to Swagger right from the beginning. So Swagger is really kind of becoming built right into ASP.NET, and it's kind of a standard. But we don't want to talk about the weather forecast. That's the main point, was just to look at the configuration changes and what how Swagger is built right into ASP.NET. Okay. If we come back to our controller now, I'm not going to focus on program.cs anymore. I want to get into actually talking about, stop, I'll rerun it when I need to. I want to look at our controller. So I'll go ahead and get into the expenses controller already. But basically, the mindset shift that I really kind of had to go through when I switched over from working a lot with SOAP and WCF into REST is I really had to kind of go through this change in the way that I looked at services, and those services I really just look at them as database, as resources, right? Because there's really not a whole lot more that they do. Yeah, there is some logic there, like who can access what, and some authorization, things like that. But all of my business logic shouldn't be happening inside of the inside of the RESTful service. And one of the things that RESTful says, it's got to be stateless. So it's really kind of just like a database. I can connect to a database, I can write a query, and if I've got the right permissions, I'll get the data out, or I can insert data, I can put data in. So it's really just kind of a web interface to interacting with a database. If your resource is a database, it also works with, other resources, just documents and so on, but we're just comparing it to database for now. So I'm going to collapse some of these. I think I could just be able to go to folding. Where's my folding? Outlining, there we go. Collapse to definitions. So if we look at our methods here, we've got, I've got get expenses, get by ID, post, or insert, or add expense, update expense, put, and delete. So really it's just my CRUD operations, right? And it is the expenses controller, which means the expenses table is in the database. That's the only thing that this should be able to affect. So really, if I'm going with the database, it's kind of a one-to-one relationship. Now, that's not strictly always true, but for the sake of argument and for the sake of discussion here, it makes it easier to kind of understand that. So if I think of an expenses table, I've got one endpoint or one controller that allows me to manage everything that goes along with that. And the way that I manage this is I'm always going to say, go to the expenses table. And then what I want to do with that, with the expenses, is completely dependent on the verb that I specify. So when I make an HTTP call, I can say, I want to get, post, put, or delete, right? Select, insert, update, delete. And so we just annotate each of these methods to deal with that. If I, so there, for get, there's generally two, one to get a list of data, one to get an individual one. So I can specify here that the URL has expenses / and then ID like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it should be able to get by ID. I should be able to get the one expense by ID to get that one record, right? So it's all based on our URL. We can see the pattern here under expenses. So this would be get all. This would be insert expense and then expense. And if I pass an ID of 1, it'll give me the expense of 1. Update, I need to specify which ID, which expense I'm updating, or which one I want to delete. So I'm just debating how deep I want to go. I just want to make sure that I don't spend too much time on something that that everybody already understands, or I don't want to blast by something if there's any questions. So just let me just stop and ask if there are any questions on setting up the controller or the methods inside of the controller, not necessarily the logic inside of there just yet. All right. So I'm going to go over to Postman now. And inside of Postman, rather than going to Swagger, there are some benefits to still using Postman, just because I've got maybe a little bit more control over what I want to type in here. So if I want to get all expenses, we'll see, we'll list expenses, and it went to my server and it gave me an array of all the expenses inside of here. Now, as you can imagine, as I start putting in more and more expenses, especially as I go over time, I'm going to have hundreds or thousands of expenses inside of here, and I don't want to return all of these expenses. So this is the thing where I want to spend maybe a little bit more time, is how REST kind of defines the way that we deal with the resources and how I would program that. So as we build this right now, I've got this this expenses. Notice we've got our URL, it goes to expenses, and I'm going to go to my get expenses. So get a list of all expenses. And the only thing the controller does, it's going to go to my expense service and say get all, to get all expenses. Now, let's go to the get all function here. And I'm going to go to implementation. And we'll see that since I'm using entity framework, I can just say db.expenses to list async. But already, this is really a short list of expenses. I think I've got like 15 expenses in here right now. I just put in a few dummy expenses, but as it grows, it's not reasonable that I'm going to display that. Even internally, right? Internally inside of a company, it's not going to be reasonable just to say, just return all expenses. I should limit how many items are inside of there. So one of the things that REST defines is I should be able to add paging to my expenses or to my list. So I should be able to say, I'm going to limit the result to only 10 expenses, or I should be able to filter them, right? So maybe a second option would be, what if I just want to filter my expenses? So the way that we deal with filtering is historically, what if I were to create another method and say, let me just create a method inside of here, and I'm going to say with HTTP GET, in addition to having the expenses, I'm going to say filter. And after the filter, I could say something like, so this is get expenses. We'll just say string category. And if I add a string category inside of here, now I've got another method in here that allows me to say, okay, we'll get that from the query string. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. We'll say from query. And as I get this from category expense service, I have a method inside of here, which will say get list by category. And I just need to specify what category I'm pulling. Let me rerun this. And you'll see by adding that method in my expenses, I now have another method where I say expenses, and there's an expenses filter. And if I want to test this method, I could say try it out, and it's going to specify category inside of there. So I could say, what do I think? I have hotel. That's a category name that I've got. And it should return a list of all the expenses that are related to hotel, or if I have a car, or maybe software. I think that's another one that I had in here. So I've got some software expenses. So it's going to return a list of all software expenses. There's a problem though. The problem is this pattern here doesn't adhere to REST standards. The REST standard is I should be able to filter without having to change the URL inside of here. I'm talking about the expenses resource, and I should just be able to add the filters right onto here. So I should be able to filter. And if we look at our query string, if we look at where that goes, if we go to Postman, if we go to expenses /filter, I'm going to add my query string, and we'll say category equals software. So we go ahead and go inside of there. So yes, I have the ability to filter. I still maybe want to say give me all expenses. This is one of the struggles that I guess I kind of had when moving over to RESTful services. It's like, well, how do I deal with all these other things that I want to do, right? I don't always want to get all expenses. I want to be able to filter. I want to be able to do, I want to apply some logic to there. So the way that we generally will deal with that is we can come in. We shouldn't have a separate method down here like this, which is expenses filter. So I'm going to get rid of the original one, and we're just going to go back to just having one that has a filter. And one option would be, I can just say string a category. So if I don't pass in a category, I can say if category is null, then we're just going to return, I'll just return right from, yeah, I'll just do it right in there, var result equals await expense service dot get list by just get all. Now this isn't very elegant, so I'm going to do it anyway. Return okay, just because of time. I don't want to think about how I'm going to refactor everything right there, so we'll say the all result, and we're going to return the all result. So the idea is, if a category isn't provided, then I'm just going to return all. If one is provided, then I'm going to provide the filtered list, right? So I should still only have a single method that returns either all or all filtered methods inside of here. So under expenses, I don't have the expenses filter inside of here anymore. So notice that I can pass in the category, or I can decide not to pass in the category. Oh, the category field is required. Let me change this. .NET Core 6, or I should say C#10, by default requires everything has to be nullable if you wanted to. String isn't null by default, right? Fun times. So let's rerun that. Let's run it from Postman. I don't have filter inside of here anymore. So we're just going to go with expenses. This should return all expenses. And if I want only certain categories, so we can see that I've got all 15 expenses here. If I want certain categories, then I should be able to say category equals office supplies. And that will return only the expenses that are related to office supplies now. All right. So I have, it's given me some ability to do that. Now, what if I want to, say either by category or by member ID or title or the amount? Maybe I want to filter what dates they are. As you can imagine, it starts to get to the point where, okay, I've got a lot of different if-then statements inside of here just to deal with all those things. So, and the other thing is we talked about, we want to be able to add paging into our service as well. So the standard practice, whenever we're dealing with lists or with a resource that we have many different resources, is number one in REST is if you have multiple resources, there should be, like if I have paging, the result or the RESTful service should give me enough information to also return so that I know what the next page is. So I shouldn't have to rely on logic on the client side to determine what's the next page and what's the next page. The service should give me all that information. Let me give you an example on how we would deal with that. I'm going to just modify this real quick to make that happen. I've got an expense filter object. So, and then we'll take a look at the code for that in just a second. So our expense filter, I can say, we'll go with filter dot base URL equals get base URL. I've just got some logic up here because I want to, as I mentioned, I want to be able to know what page I'm going to. So I just have some logic to build the base URL. So I know what website, what URL to return back to the client. So I'm going to have the get base URL. Let me make one more change. Say get filtered list, and I'm going to pass in my filter object. So with our filter object, if I open up these expenses now, notice that I have a whole lot of different things that I could filter now. I could filter, like I could specify what my page size is or what page I'm wanting to go to, what the size of the page is. If I don't specify any of those, let me just go to, I'll go to Postman. I think we can see it a little bit easier there. If I go to just expenses, the whole result is going to be different, right? Before, we just had an array of all expenses inside of here, but that is not very self-explanatory. This result is just a list of expenses, and the client has to know what that is. It's not self-describing. So instead, I want it to look more, not like that. String cannot be of 0 length. Let's do page equals 1. You got to love it when you got, yes, I've got bugs. Sorry. It's supposed to default to page 1 when I don't put a page in there. So I obviously didn't fix that all the way. So the result is completely different. Now, if you've done work with other APIs, which I'm assuming most of you have, or all of you, this structure should look familiar. We've got an object that says, I've got a total number of 15 expenses, but it's split across 2 pages. And I've got my current page is 1, and there is no previous page. And if I want to go to the next page, I need to provide a URL to get me to that page. Oh, I don't think this is my latest code because that and shouldn't be there. It should still work, but there we have that. So we've got, so it took me to page 2, and notice the previous page is page 1. And over here, my previous page is null because there is no previous page. And then there's a page. And then there's a data object, which actually is the array of all the expenses that I'm interested in. So this is this is the part that's, to me, is quite interesting. How do I deal with this? How do I build the logic to have it be self-explaining to give that kind of information back to the user, right? First of all, let's look at a couple of different things. I've got another option where I could say page is 1 and size. Let's say that I only want 3 pages or 3 records at a time. So I've given the ability to limit the size to however I want to, but it gives you, on the server, gives you the ability to say, you know, I only want to return 10 records at a time. So nobody can bog down your server by requesting 1 million records at once, right? So here I can say page size 3. Now I've still got 15 records, but my total pages is 5. The current page is 1. The second page is page 2, still size 3. So if I come to there, now I'm on page 2. And so it allows me to page back and forth. I can go all the way to, let me just switch to page 4 here. And I should see that the previous page is page 3 and the next page is page 5. One thought that I had as I was kind of preparing to talk about this is At most of the places where I've worked, most of the time I'm building APIs that are internal use APIs. So I'm providing data to either another team that's a front-end development team, or I'm providing data to some other internal software development team. And we want to get things done quickly. And so it's really easy to say, well, I'm just going to give you an array. And as long as you know what that array does, you go ahead and deal with that. And that's what I was talking about, the mentality of coming from like the old SOAP or WCF or RPC type services. That's how we did things. We would come to an agreement on what data they wanted, and then I would send that to them, instead of focusing on a resource like this, where if now I build a resource and say, you know what, we're going to constrain it where you can only get 10 records at a time, then that is a standard, and the client will know how to pull that data. And we don't customize what data we send back and forth, because it's all driven by the resource, right? I've actually had there's a lot of conflicting kind of philosophies and thoughts around this. And people say, well, you know, REST says that this is what REST says you should do. And but we can be flexible over here. There's a different version of REST that allows you to do that. I'm of the opinion that if you don't adhere to the REST principles, you're not strictly doing REST. You might be doing something that is like REST. It might be mostly RESTful, but if we're not adhering to all the principles of REST, then we're not truly doing everything that's REST inside there. So I'm not advocating that this is the best solution always. I'm just saying you have to make a clear decision whether or not this is the approach that you want to take, right? If you want to say, I go 100% REST, then we can go that way. Otherwise, you have to start kind of redefining the rules and coming up with your own standards. So because we're starting to sway away from standards a little bit. In any case, let's take a look at how we built that. So here I can say page 4, size 3. If I go to with cat, I'm going to say, and let's go subcategory. I actually haven't implemented all of them. Subcategory is 2. That's my travel subcategory. Now, if I go with subcat is 2, we're going to see my total count is only 4. My total pages is 2. I had a little error. Since there's only 2 pages and I'm trying to get the current page of 4, I got nothing. So I really need to switch back to page 1. And then because I have 2 pages, I've got page 1 will return that. And if you remember, there are a bunch of different things that I could build onto my category. So maybe, let me try this. I think I have, what was it, start? Yeah, it was start. And start equals 2022 03 10. And I'm going to go with, let's just go with subcategory 1. Actually, I'm going to get rid of subcategory because I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't have anything after that date. So I would need to look at what's inside the date. So the idea is I've got 10 or 12 different, well, maybe not that many different items in my filter that I could possibly have inside of my filter. So let's take a look at how we built that. Instead of listing out all the different possibilities like I had before with category, I created an expense filter object that has all the different possible things I might be filtering. In .NET, the way that we deal with that is, if I go to my models, I'm going to have an input model. That's my expense filter model. And I can just annotate what each of these things are. So to build this model, I'm going to say from query, it's going to look for page, and I'm going to have an object that's page, and they all need to be nullable, as you can see. So size, excuse me. So page size. So how many records per page? What title filter, category filter, subcategory, member ID, start and end date, and so on. So that's how I'm building the filter. I've just got this filter object that stores all the different things that I might filter. In my service, In my service, I use that information. Let's just look at the query first. The query that's kind of interesting to us is this one, this bottom one. I still want to play with this a little bit. It's not, I don't feel like it's as elegant as I want it to be, but it gets the job done right now. So we're going to say, I'm going to go to the expenses table and we're going to do our where clause. So if the start date has a value, then we want to filter by start date. So we're going to say expense date is greater than start date. If we have an end date, then we're going to also filter by end date. If we have a member ID, we're going to filter by that. If we have a title, if we have a subcategory, I didn't put in the category yet. I guess I could do that as well. But so I get all the data, I provide all of my filters, and then I specify any other order by, any kind of sorting that I want to do. And here's where my paging comes in. So I need to determine how many pages I'm going to skip, or how many records I'm going to skip, and then how many records I'm going to include. So if my page size is 3, I want to only include 3 records. But if I'm on page 4, then I want to skip 12 records and then only take the next 3, right? So I need to calculate how many records to skip and what my page size is going to be. And I do that up here. So in my requested page, I can just determine what page I'm currently on, what page was being requested. And the current page is, because obviously we're 0 based, we're going to go by because of skipping. If the current page is 0, we're not going to skip any. And then we're just going to say, we're going to multiply that by page size to determine how many items we should skip. So current page times the page size. You'll notice that I actually did that filter twice. That's one of the things that I don't love about my current solution is I need to get a count of how many records actually come back with that filter, right? With that specific filter, I need to count all those records. So I did that once. I got so I can run that just to get the count, because this one will only give me 3 records, so the count would be incorrect. I need to get a count of all of them, and then we're going to get that record. And then finally, I did some logic. I did some logic to determine, how I'm going to build the page. So if the total pages, is going to be expense count divided by page size. We're going to get the remainder. That's just so we round up, because before, so that can just give me, that's just the idea to give me an idea of how many pages there are to loop through. And then this logic just allows me to determine the link. I also had a little bit of a challenge coming up with the URL, right? The URL should, like if I want to go to the next page, let's just go to page 1-3. The URL should include all of the filters that were in there so that I'm not losing all those filters. So I had to build some logic to deal with that. And that is actually in my expense filter object. So I have some logic inside of here that allowed me to build the query string, to rebuild the query string the same way that it was before. So it's going to determine what's currently being filtered, and it's going to rebuild that query string for me. And so I can say the next page and the previous page will build that whole URL.
Hey, Gregor.
Yeah.
There's a question about pagination. So Caleb asked, does ASP.NET keep track of the original results when doing pagination? So for example, if one of the records were deleted, is it possible that one of the records would show up multiple times if it were on the boundary of the page size and the records were queried from scratch each time?
So that's a good question. By default, ASP.NET is not going to do that inside of there. Now, if we're dealing now, one of the other things that REST kind of what REST defines is that we should enable caching, right? So RESTful service should be caching. As you can see, the logic that I have inside of here, there's a lot going on inside of there, especially in the service, because every time I run this, I have to run, I'm hitting the database once to get the total count, and then once for the other data. So this is where caching comes in. If I enable caching and if I add a middleware, the .NET middleware to allow for caching, then you're not going to, then it's not going to be affected. Once you go to that page, then the total count will stay the same as long as that data is cached, because you're going to be pulling from cache. Does that make sense? But if you're not using caching, which it does, it's not enabled by default, then it's going to hit the database every time. So the records could actually change from time to time. Caching, of course, here is going to be different than sessions, right? Back in the old ASP.NET days and just classic ASP, we did a lot with sessions where we could put like some application variables where we could cache per session. We're not caching per session. If we cache something, that's going to be global. So anybody that's accessing the service would have the same result set. And then you'd only get the updated records once the cache expires.
Sweet, thank you.
Yep. So in any case, the other thing that I wanted to note is this is building the object. And then I had, finally, I had an output model. So in my models, here's an output model. I've got a base class that is a response list. So if I wanted to do the same thing like with my categories, if I had like dozens of categories and I wanted to add pagination, then my categories controller could do it, and my subcategories controller. So my response list has the objects where we've got a total count, the total pages, the current page, previous and next, and then the list of whatever data we have inside of here. So in order to make this work for my expenses, if I go to the expense list response, I just go ahead and create a new class that inherits from response list, and we know it's of data type expenses. So in my service, once I have all my data, I just create a new response object that is of type expense list response, and I populate it with all of the things that I calculated, the total number of pages, the total records, what page I'm on, next and previous page, and then of course the list of expenses. And then that's what gets returned to the client. That is really pretty much what I wanted to cover today. So are there any other questions?
I didn't really have any questions, but I did want to, I appreciate the showing us the changes, especially the null, having the null string value in C# 10. That's something I would not have picked up on, and also some of the changes to not having the startup class anymore. So appreciate that.
No problem. Thank you.
I have a question about Swagger and its usage. I've been in the ASP.NET days back in 2.0 and 3.0, so lots of things has changed. And I went to the Swagger page, and it looks like it's a paid project. How do you access, or what should you consider when you get these Visual Studios that it will automatically launch a project that will run Swagger? I know you went by really quickly, but a short summary, I would appreciate it.
Sure, no problem. I think if I look at Swagger, so Swagger, getting Swagger into your project is actually not a paid service. I think the Swagger website itself, they probably offer some additional services that you can have, but just to get Swagger, that is just an add-on to, I'm going to stop debugging here real quick. It's just an add-on. It was, when was it introduced? I'm not even sure. It's been several years now that it was introduced, and we would go in and we would add the Swagger package, right? The Swashbuckle package installed. Since I've got any framework, there's several others involved as well, but besides the Swashbuckle. So, as long as you have access to that, and that's a freely downloadable service, that allows you to run like your development environment through Swagger. I think what that service is more of a development server where you could, I believe, I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but I've worked with some of that a little bit, where you could deploy to a test server, or you can get some additional services where you can run and test Swagger like within the team, not just on your own development machine. But one of the things to note here, the way that I generally use it, we don't want that in production, right? We don't want people to go and be able to see what the methods are. So by default, Swagger here is at the end, we have this if app environment is development, it'll enable Swagger and the Swagger UI. So if we're not in the development environment, as soon as we switch to production mode or release mode, then that web page won't come up anymore. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. When you created the project, was there a project that you create that it automatically puts this
Oh, yes,
framework
sorry.
together?
Let's go there again. I won't create it again this time, but I'll at least we'll take a look at where that was. So if I create a new project, hopefully it doesn't take as long this time. Of course it does. Okay, so really over here, since these are my recent templates, it's really just the ASP.NET Core Web API. But if I'm in C#, if I go to project types, we'll be in there. I think I can just search. So we'll go with API. And it's the first one that comes up. So if I'm already filtering for C# and I just put in API, I've got ASP.NET Core Web API. The difference here, if I go with ASP.NET Web Application.NET Framework, that's going to be your traditional .NET framework, right? It's not going to be Core anymore. And there should be, oh, because I put an API, that's not in there. What if I do ASP.NET? There's a web app versus web API. So those are going to be quite different. You can use a web app to build these RESTful services as well. But in addition to that, it will also create pages. And you can choose whether you go with like MVC pages, or I think the default though is Razor pages now. If you don't specify something. So, oh, it does. It says right there, it's Razor pages. So if I go with Core Web App Model View Controller, that's the traditional MVC approach. And all three of those would support the web API. I don't believe this one or this one includes Swagger, but the web API does.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that.
Not a problem.
I just want to add, I'm pretty sure that if you're a version behind on Visual Studio or .NET Core, and you're looking at creating a project using .NET 5, that you will get. I'm pretty sure that the Core Web API template for .NET 5 also includes Swagger by default.
Oh, did it? Okay.
I think it does. And if it doesn't, it's not that hard to add. But I think it adds it by default it's just in the startup class rather than the program class.
And now that you mentioned that, Gary, I think the reason I thought that is I probably had created a model view controller project before, which creates the MVC, and you can add APIs, and it doesn't, and so Swagger is not included. I think that's probably what ended up happening for me.
Yeah.
So, any other thoughts or questions? Well, thank you.